Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the very last of our last of the 43rd annual interdisciplinary lecture series. Hard to believe that we've gone through an entire year of curricular activities in the MacLean Center. I do want to just take a moment to especially thank Dr. Micah Prohaska for leading the group of faculty who developed the schedule this year. And those, so yes, yeah. Other faculty who were instrumental on that group that put together the schedule is Professor Lori Zoloff, Professor Valerie Gutman-Koch, and Professor Dan Brudney. So thank you all also very much. We won't be meeting next Wednesday, nor for the next several Wednesdays until the end of September, when we will start again. Just as a preview for next year, Dr. Brian Callender is working with a group of faculty to coordinate a series entitled Dying, Death, and Beyond. So should be an uplifting series, and I encourage you to look for the calendar and plan on joining us next year. We are anticipating using this same room again, which is very brisk today, so welcome to the spring. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Carl Elliott, and welcome him back to the MacLean Center, where he completed a clinical ethics fellowship in 1989 to 90. Carl Elliott is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota. He is the author or editor of 8 books, the most recent of which is this book, called The Occasional Human Sacrifice. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, the Carrie and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Library of Congress, a resident fellowship at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio, and a visiting associate professorship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In addition to his articles in academic journals, he's also written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, The New York Review of Books, The American Scholar, and The New York Times. So it is a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Elliott.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks for coming. It's great to be back in Hyde Park again after all these years. This is going to be a very demoralizing talk. I'm just warning you in advance. Let me see if I can make this thing work here. All right. So back about 10 or 12 years ago, this was during a period when I was locked in an especially bitter struggle with my employer, the University of Minnesota. I noticed this change in my Netflix algorithm, that function that says you might like this movie. So instead of the usuals for me, which tended to be sort of a mix of sports dramas and documentaries about Watergate, it started recommending a different kind of genre, revenge movies, vigilante movies, a genre that it called gritty fight the system movies. And to be honest, I loved these things, especially these gritty fight the system movies. I couldn't get enough of them. They had all the elements that were like designed to appeal to me. A righteous struggle, a determined underdog, a moral arc that bent towards justice, and very often an incredibly satisfying ending in a courtroom where the judge bangs a gavel and the courtroom erupts in cheers, and the bad guys are led away in handcuffs. This is kind of what whistleblower stories are supposed to be like. Kurt Vonnegut used to call these man-in-a-hole stories. Basically, the whistleblower exposes the truth and brings down the corrupt organization. So Kurt Vonnegut called these man-in-a-hole stories, and he said, um, these are stories where somebody gets into trouble and then gets out again. And he plotted the arc of these stories on a graph. And you can kind of see it here. Dorothy kills the wicked witch and returns to Kansas. Shane defeats the villain and rides off into the sunset. Robinson Crusoe is rescued from the island. David defeats the Goliath. The prodigal son is welcomed home. He said, we all love these man-in-a-hole stories because they're so hopeful and they're so reassuring. And they tell us that the universe makes a kind of moral sense. I mean, some of us grew up hearing a man-in-a-hole story every Sunday morning. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. There's a man who got out of the hole. There's something missing in these man-in-a-hole stories, and what's missing is what it's like to be in the hole. Because when you're in the hole, your thoughts, they turn inward, and basically the world outside the hole tends to vanish, and all you can think about is yourself and how to get out of the hole. You might not even know that it's a hole that you're in, right? Could be a cave. Could be the trunk of a car. It could be the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's porch steps. All you know is that you're thrashing around in the dark. So this book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, it's kind of framed by my own experience at the University of Minnesota, where I spent the better part of 7 years trying to get an external investigation of the suicide of a young man named Dan Markingson in a research study in our Department of Psychiatry. I'll give you the brief version of that story. So this is a picture of Dan and his mother, Mary Weiss. Basically, Dan was psychotic, delusional, and under a civil commitment order in 2003 when he was recruited from a locked unit at our teaching hospital into a study of antipsychotic drugs, recruited over the objections of his mother, Mary Weiss, who was pictured there with him, and who was his only family member. So Mary Weiss did not want him in the study. He was incompetent to consent. He was threatening to kill people. She was one of the people he was threatening to kill. And he was under this stay of commitment order that directed him to obey the recommendations of the psychiatrist who was recruiting him into the study. She tried to get him out. He was told, no, he signed the consent form. He's an adult. He's in the study. And so he was signed up and sent to a halfway house. Mary Weiss spent the next 4 months trying to get him out of the study. She called, she emailed, she went to the department, she wrote letters to the chair, warning again and again that he's getting much worse. She's really worried about him. In April, she leaves a voice message for the study coordinator saying, look, does he have to kill himself or kill somebody else before anybody's going to do anything? 3 weeks after that message, Dan tried to decapitate himself with a box cutter. And his body was found in the bathroom of the halfway house, along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. So I spent over 6 years digging into that story, trying to get it investigated. I wrote about it for Mother Jones Magazine in 2010, spent another 5 years filing complaints to regulatory bodies, writing editorials, lobbying politicians, organizing protests, petitions, vigils, all of it with zero success, and I mean zero success. This did not make me a terribly popular figure in the medical school or in the bioethics center for that matter. But eventually, with the help of a former governor by the name of Arne Carlson, we managed to get an investigation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is a watchdog agency in the state of Minnesota. And when it came back in March of 2015, it kind of felt like a vindication, right? Coercion, conflicts of interest, a lot of the things that I think any reasonable person could have seen in the study from the very beginning. So if this had been one of those gritty fight the system movies, this would be where the credits start to roll. But here's the thing. It turns out that vindication isn't really the same thing as getting out of the hole. It's more like crawling out of a ditch in the middle of the desert. I would say, if anything, being vindicated made my colleagues in the Academic Health Center hate me even more than they did before. And to be honest, it didn't really change anything. There was no official apology. There was no compensation for Mary Weiss. There were no sanctions for the researchers, and no real reform at the University of Minnesota. And so today, 10 years after the fact, the whole episode has been almost completely forgotten. I mean, so by almost any standard, that was a failure. So what kind of story do you tell about that? Well, several years ago, mainly I think as a way of trying to figure out how things might have gone better, what other things I might have done, I started teaching a class only on medical research scandals. Deeply demoralizing class, all scandals, only scandals, 2 a week for a semester. We start with the classics, Tuskegee, Willowbrook, Cincinnati, and we move on to present day abuses. And there's always something in the news for us to look at. My thought was, look, maybe if I can put a lot of these scandals side by side, I can see what sort of patterns might emerge by comparing them. And what I found was that my experience at the University of Minnesota was actually pretty typical, in that research institutions never do the right thing. They deny wrongdoing, they stonewall the press, they protect their own faculty members, they rarely apologize, and basically do whatever they can to avoid compensating the victims or their families. And the whistleblowers are ostracized, fired, sued, and at least one case reported to the police. The other thing that I found is that whistleblowers are actually pretty rare. In most of the scandals that we look at in the class, doctors, nurses, study personnel all know that patients are dying, that they're being exploited, that they're being deceived, that they're being lied to. Often they know these things for years, and they say nothing, right? They just stay quiet. So I started to wonder, what is the difference with those people who did step out of line? You know, the people who did speak out, how did they explain it? Why did they do what they did? What kind of stories did they tell about their experience? And so here are the cases that I wound up looking at for the book. Are these men in a hole stories? Well, not exactly. And it's not just because they don't end on an upward curve. Well, sometimes they do. But very often, even when they do, the whistleblowers don't feel that way. A lot of them come away from the experience very deeply scarred, and the scars mark them for the rest of their lives. Not just because they've been threatened or fired or formally punished, although a lot of them were. Seems to be something deeper going on, right? It's almost like when I was talking to them, I got the sense that their lives were divided into 2 parts. There's before they blew the whistle, and there's after they blew the whistle. And those 2 parts are divided by this sort of profound existential break. Because after they blow the whistle, the world never looks the same to them anymore. So why do they do it? Now, when I first started talking to whistleblowers, I thought there would be a simple way to find out why they blew the whistle, and that would be to ask them the question, why did you blow the whistle? Turns out it's not so simple. Right? When you do that, they give you answers that are not entirely straightforward. In other words, they don't generally give you a moral argument. They don't appeal to foundational principles. They don't talk about the Bible. They don't talk about the Hippocratic Oath. Instead, they'll say things like, well, if I didn't say anything, how would I explain that to my children? Or how can I keep quiet and look at myself in the mirror every morning? So they answer the question with these sort of non-answers. So let me give you an example. One not from my book. I always try to bring Richard Nixon into every talk that I give. So if you're old enough, not many people here are, I'm guessing, but if you're old enough to remember the Senate Watergate hearings, 1973, I was in middle school at the time. There's a moment that's probably seared into your brain, and it's this one, Alexander Butterfield. It's the moment when Alexander Butterfield, who's an aide to Bob Haldeman, tells the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon has installed a secret taping system in the Oval Office. So this turns out to be the pivotal moment in Nixon's downfall. So because after this, the hard evidence of his crimes can't be hidden anymore. It's on tape. What I want to point out, though, is not what Butterfield did, but how he explained it. Because when he was asked later why he did it, he said, well, I answered truthfully because I'm a truthful person. In other words, I did it because that's the kind of person I am. Now, I'm not the first person to notice these sort of non-explanations by whistleblowers. This is a terrific book on whistleblowing by the political scientist Fred Alford, who spent years interviewing whistleblowers, not medical ones, usually government, engineering, corporate whistleblowers. And he admires whistleblowers, but he's struck by how often whistleblowers will turn a moral question about the well-being of others into a moral question about themselves. He says, look, even if these people feel empathy for the victims, even if they're acting out of principle, that's not what they talk about. What do they talk about? They talk about themselves. They talk about facing their kids. They're talking about holding their heads up, about looking in the mirror. And he calls this narcissism moralized. He says, whistleblowers are obsessed with their own moral purity. Again, I love this book. It's a terrific book. I'll talk about it later. I don't think he's quite understanding. I think he's wrong about this, right? When I talk to whistleblowers, I don't hear narcissism. What I hear is the ethic of honor and shame. Yes, it's true that whistleblowers talk a lot about themselves. That's what honor and shame are all about. That's what distinguishes the honor ethic from, say, civic duty or utilitarianism or Kantian deontology. It's about your obligations to yourself, right? So of course whistleblowers talk about themselves. Perfectly natural thing for them to talk about. Ethical honor is fundamentally about respect and self-respect. That's what people mean when they say things like, how could I hold my head up? What they're getting at is, how could I respect myself? Right? Honor is not just about getting respect from others, although that's very important in the honor ethic. That's why insults require response in the honor ethic. But it's also about deserving respect. Right? You want to be the kind of person who is worthy of the respect you get. And if you fail, you feel ashamed of yourself. That's not wounded narcissism. That's just what happens when an honorable person fails to measure up to the honor code. So let me give you some examples from the book. Ron Jones. So Ron is one of the 3 doctors who exposed the so-called unfortunate experiment at National Women's Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand. This is a study where women with cervical cancer, actually a precursor of cervical cancer, were left untreated for decades to see if it would progress. And many of those women died. When I asked Ron what tipped the balance for him, he just said, well, it's probably a reflection of the nature of the man I am. Oscar Simonson at Karolinska Institute in Sweden. He's one of the surgeons who helped expose the crimes of Paolo Macchiarini. He said, well, because I have to be able to hold my head up. Or John Pasando at the Fred Hutch in Seattle. John told me, I'd like to think that I've never hurt another person in this life, at least not deliberately. And that's just who I am. To me, these people sound a lot like Alexander Butterfield. I did it because I'm the kind of person who does that. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not endorsing the content of the honor ethic, because there's a serious downside to the honor ethic, and the downside is violence, right? I'm just trying to make a diagnosis. I'm trying to answer the question, what are people trying to say when they say things like, how do I hold my head up? Sometimes when I talk about honor, somebody will say, all this honor talk makes me really uncomfortable. Couldn't you talk about professional ethics instead? Which I would happily do if anybody that I ever talked to mentioned professional ethics to me. But they don't. What they talk about is looking at themselves in the mirror, about being true to their own values. What I should say, though, is if it makes you feel better, just substitute the word integrity for honor. It's very similar. The reason I like honor is because in the honor ethic, it's important not just to do the right thing, it's also important to be seen to be doing the right thing, right? There's a very public aspect to the honor ethic that you don't get in the notion of integrity. And this seems to be a really important part of the whistleblower struggle, which is how do you maintain your self-respect when you've lost the respect of your community, right? What story do you tell yourself when being true to your own code of honor means becoming an enemy in the eyes of the people that you respect and admire? To ask somebody, why did you blow the whistle, also suggests that they made a choice to blow the whistle. But often what they'll tell you is that it didn't really feel like a choice, right? This is what Butterfield said about the Senate Watergate Committee, that he didn't know what they were going to ask him. What he did know, though, as a matter of absolute certainty, was he wasn't going to lie, right? This is what you hear from whistleblowers all the time. I had no choice. Fred Alford says, the question that whistleblowers ask themselves is not, why did I do it, but rather, how did it happen that I found myself in this strange position where this is the only thing I could do? But obviously, they did have a choice, right? What are they trying to get at when they say I didn't have a choice? Because clearly they could have stayed quiet. That's what most people do. Alfred thinks this is a kind of psychological self-protection against the knowledge that you volunteered for what turned out to be a professional suicide mission. That it's hard to live with the thought that you brought this all on yourself. And he may be right. But I think there's something else going on. And it's related to something that Stanley Hauerwas says in his book, The Peaceable Kingdom, which is that sometimes a moral choice is less like a decision and it's like a kind of discovery of who you are. Right? In other words, you don't choose to blow the whistle. You discover that you're the kind of person who can't keep quiet, right? That the choice has already been made for you by the kind of life that you've lived up to that point. And I think maybe this is why the struggle seems like such a profound existential break for these people. Because blowing the whistle, it requires a certain amount of idealism, right? There's a reason cynics don't blow the whistle. They're convinced that the system is rigged, right? To blow the whistle, you have to have some kind of expectation that if you speak out about something that is obviously cruel or corrupt or unfair, then other people are going to be as outraged as you are. And it turns out that almost never happens, right? You think the authorities are going to leap into action, and they don't. You think your colleagues are going to stand by you, and they don't. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're treated like Judas Iscariot. And so that comes as a profound shock. You kind of walk away really shaken and kind of disoriented because your whole view of the way the world works has been upended. And that drives a lot of people to a really dark place. Now, there was one conversation that I had that really sticks with me with Matthias Corbaccio. So Matthias is another one of those surgeons, the cardiovascular surgeons in Sweden who helped expose the crimes of Paolo Marchiarini at the KI, at the Karolinska Institute. And when I was talking to him, he told me a story from his time in high school when police found cocaine in the car of a friend of his. And the friend told everybody the cocaine belonged to Matthias. Matthias said, look, I was 17 years old. I'd never done cocaine in my life. But that feeling of being wrongly accused, that stuck with him. He says that's what blowing the whistle felt like, right? It's not just that the real offenders get off, it's that you're seen with such contempt. He says all your illusions that there's some kind of justice in the world are shattered. I heard something similar from Mike Wilkins. So Mike is an internist. He blew the whistle in 1972 on the horrific abuses inflicted on mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook State School in New York. And he says, you know, in our heads, we knew that we were doing something good, but nobody else thought that. And so instead of feeling proud of what he was doing, he felt guilty and ashamed, like he was going to be punished at any moment, right? He said, you know, it's like that episode in Huckleberry Finn, when Huck or Jim are riding the raft on the Mississippi, and Huck says, you know, I'm going to hell because my preacher says I'm helping this man escape and God wants him to be a slave. Now, you might be thinking, look, these people that you're talking about, they just sound really naive. They don't know how the world really works. And you may be right. And whistleblowers themselves will often talk about how naive they were before they spoke out. But afterwards, it's like nothing is the same anymore. It comes close to a kind of nihilism, a kind of loss of meaning entirely. I think of it as like a character from a Frank Capra film who suddenly finds himself in a film noir. So like in Frank Capra's movies, you know, It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, you know how the world works. Right is right, wrong is wrong. It's very clear who the heroes are and the villains are. But in a film noir, you know, a film like Double Indemnity or The Third Man, you're in a world where nothing is really what it seems, right? It's all shadows, it's all confusion, it's all blurred moral lines. Fate's random. Everybody's alone. Justice is an illusion. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. That's what the world looks like after the whistle's blown. So back when I was working on this book, this was back in 2019, I was in the Library of Congress for a semester. And I went to the Carnegie Institute in DC to see the Joe Calloway Awards. These are basically whistleblower awards. And one of the whistleblowers being honored that evening was Mitch Barnett, right? He's one of the guys who had reported safety violations at Boeing and eventually got so angry and demoralized that he left the company. And shortly after he left, 2 Boeing 737 MAX jet airliners went down within 5 months of each other and killed 346 people. And so we were all there in an auditorium like this. And when they announced the award, everybody gave him a standing ovation, which he absolutely deserved. What he did was heroic. But what I remember about that night, as we were all standing up and applauding them, and the other whistleblower being honored, is that they didn't look all that happy. They didn't look nearly as happy as those of us in the audience did. I thought they looked pretty bad, and I started wondering what their lives are going to be like the next day, you know, once they go home and the applause has stopped. You know, I don't know what it was like the next day, but 4 years later, Barnett was found dead in Charleston, South Carolina. He was being deposed in a whistleblower retaliation suit. His body was found in a pickup along with a gun, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. A lot of people were shocked by that. I don't think that they should have been nearly as that shocked. This is not that uncommon. A study by Whistleblowers Australia found that nearly half of the whistleblowers that they interviewed had considered taking their own lives. Now, I talked about this public aspect of honor, the way that it's important not just to do the right thing, but to be seen to be doing the right thing. The problem is, when you blow the whistle, you become absolutely toxic. You're radioactive. Nobody wants to be around you. You're canceled. Right? even people who might be secretly sympathetic are afraid to say so or even be seen in your company because they're afraid they're going to become radioactive too. And so what this means is the whistleblowers are sort of sent into exile from their own community. Right? They're cut off from this group of people who's given them their identity, their sense of who they are. And they're cut off precisely because they have done what they think their own code of honor requires them to do. And that doesn't end when they're vindicated. It's not as if they're welcomed back into the fold. The exile is permanent. So this is back about 7 or 8 years ago when I was working on the book. I went to the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis to see Ibsen's play, Enemy of the People. I thought I needed to see this because it's sort of the canonical whistleblower story. It was about this whistleblower doctor by the name of Thomas Stockman, who discovers that the water in his town is contaminated. And he tries to warn everybody. But nobody believes him. In fact, they get angry on him. They turn on him. And even members of his own family turn on him. And so he's treated like a traitor, which all tracks, except for the ending, when the play sort of comes to the conclusion, and there's this famous moment where Stockman is standing with his fist in the air and says, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands alone." Now, that's supposed to be a hopeful ending, right? That's supposed to make this a man in a whole story, which is to say, well, Stockman may have lost, but he's emerged unbroken. I think the problem with this ending is that in reality, standing alone is a recipe for self-immolation, right? If you look at the whistleblowers who have survived to tell their stories, what you'll often find is that there wasn't just a single whistleblower standing alone. There's a group of whistleblowers working together. So in Auckland, there were 3. There was Ron Jones, but there was also Bill McIndoe and Jacques MacLean. With the Macchiarini scandal in Sweden, there were 4, 3 surgeons and an intensivist. With the Cincinnati radiation studies, the whistleblower, Martha Stevens, she was working with her junior faculty association. And at Willowbrook, the whistleblower, Mike Wilkins, was working with a whole collective of activist doctors, many of whom were living together under one roof. So solidarity turns out to be crucial for surviving the ordeal psychologically. But it's not the only thing. Just look at the old famous Stanley Milgram obedience studies. Now, what everybody remembers about these studies is that 65% of the subjects in these studies obeyed the orders of a man in a white coat to give what they thought could be lethal electrical shocks to an innocent person. Everybody remembers that. What they don't remember is that Milgram did follow-up studies, right? And the follow-up studies pointed towards a solution, right? Milgram found that he could tip the scales away from obedience and towards the demands of conscience if he manipulated the conditions of the study. So the biggest change was if he put Confederates in the room who objected to the study, right? So if the fake scientist in the white coat was accompanied by another couple of fake scientists in white coats who objected, said, I don't know, I think we may be going too far, then none of the subjects were willing to continue with it. They all, without exception, refused to keep shocking what they thought were giving shocks to the other person. And if a subject was placed at the table with 2 other fake subjects who refused, then they were much less likely to go ahead and give the shocks themselves. So in other words, people in the study were far more likely to follow their conscience if they didn't feel so isolated and so alone in their dissent. So the key to dissent turns out to be solidarity. But that is a hopeful message, and I would not want anyone to leave this room feeling hopeful. So I want to finish with another demoralizing thing that I learned from my research scandals course. So I've talked about the whistleblowers, You might be wondering, as I did, what about the researchers in charge of these abuses, right? Whatever happened to them? So I got another story to tell you here. This is June of 2017 in Cincinnati. So I'd gone in Cincinnati to meet this woman, Martha Stevens, who was the whistleblowing English professor who exposed the Cincinnati radiation studies back in 1972. So these were Pentagon-funded studies during the Vietnam War designed to figure out how radiation would affect American soldiers in the case of a nuclear attack. Right? So to do that, a radiologist by the name of Eugene Sanger was subjecting poor cancer patients, 60% of whom were Black, to total body irradiation without telling them why, without telling them that it was at the direction of the Pentagon, and without telling them that it might kill them, which it did in some cases. So I had read that the hospital at the University of Cincinnati had been forced to put up a memorial to these patients, to these research subjects, as a result of a legal settlement. And I never heard of a hospital doing such a thing. So I decided I need to see this memorial. So I turn up in Cincinnati and I go to the hospital, and I couldn't find it. And I asked around, and nobody had ever heard of it. Nobody had ever heard of the Cincinnati radiation studies either. But they were very helpful, and they started calling around, and eventually they located a young woman in the radioisotope lab who knew what I was talking about. And she came up, and she led me down into the sub-basement through this long, winding series of tunnels until we got to a stairwell. She took me up the stairwell, and we emerged into the sunlight. And we're standing in this sort of empty courtyard behind like a parking ramp and some heating equipment. And it kind of seemed like the place where, employees might sneak out for a smoke while nobody's looking. But no memorial. And so I say, where's the memorial? And she says, well, it's right over there. And this is what she's pointing to. And I'm like, that looks like shrubbery to me. She goes, yeah, it is a little grown up, isn't it? But if you go back, like just wedge yourself against that wall there and go back and look out, you'll see the memorial behind the shrubbery. And so that's what I did. I went back there, and it was pretty small, about 2 feet by 2 feet. It has a list of names and the header, In Memoriam Radiation Effects Study, 1960 to 72. And kind of weirdly, it faced the wall of the hospital, so you had to kind of like stand like this in order to see it. So I took a picture or two to show to Martha Stevens, and then the woman with me said, well, would you like to see the Sanger lab? And I'm thinking, Sanger, as in Eugene Sanger? As in the architect of the atrocities, Eugene Sanger? I just didn't say that out loud. I just said, what I said was, I'd love to see the Sanger. And she took me up, and there's this sort of little shrine there to Eugene Sanger in the corner. It's got photos and old medical instruments and honors a lot of his awards. And I thought, this is the way things work in academic medicine. To a doctor behind the atrocities, a shrine, to the victims, a plaque hidden in the shrubbery. And it turns out, if you look at other studies, you'll see something very similar. So, for example, take John Cutler. So Cutler was implicated both in the Tuskegee syphilis studies and then later in the Guatemala syphilis studies. This is the man who, according to the President's Commission that looked into this, dripped gonorrheal pus into the eyes of a dying woman in Guatemala to see if they would become infected. They did. So what happened to Cutler? Afterwards, he was named Dean of Public Health at Pittsburgh, and when he retired, there was a named lectureship in his honor. This is Saul Krugman, the NYU pediatrician who gave hepatitis A and B to institutionalized mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook School. What happened to him right after he was exposed? His colleagues elected him president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is Albert Kligman, the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist who famously said on his first visit to Holmesburg Prison and saw the prisoners there that he saw acres of skin like a farmer gazing on a fertile field. Among his many crimes was to take $10,000 from Dow Chemicals to expose prisoners to the active ingredient in Agent Orange. So what happened to him? Too many honors and awards and honorary degrees to list here, but among them, the presidency of his specialty organization. Chester Southam, who injected live cancer cells into elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in New York. What happened to him? His colleagues elected him president of the American Association for Cancer Research. Eugene Sanger, who I just mentioned, after he was exposed, his radiology colleagues gave him their highest honor. Robert Heath, the psychiatrist who at Tulane worked with the CIA, who accidentally killed two of his mentally ill patients by giving them brain abscesses, and then famously tried to use deep brain stimulation to turn one of his gay patients straight. What was his punishment? I think you're seeing a pattern here. Now, you might be thinking, look, that's all in the distant past, right? And aren't some of these honors being reconsidered now after the fact? And that's true in the case of Cutler and Kligman. But you'd be wrong to think that this is not the way it happens now. For example, during the 8 long years that the Dan Markinson scandal was in the public eye at the University of Minnesota, our chair of psychiatry, co-investigator on that study, just kept collecting honors and awards. And finally, you're still hanging on to the hope that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. Have a look at the bone marrow transplant scandal at the Fred Hutch, where at least 21 people died. The whistleblower in that case, John Pasando, lost his job. He never worked in cancer research again. He spent the rest of his life reviewing disability claims for the federal government. What about the co-investigator on that study, Don Thomas? Well, in 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So let me just finish by turning back to the question that I started with, which is, what does this mean for whistleblowers? Because every whistleblower needs some way of making sense to what happened, of what's happened to them. Everybody's got to tell themselves a story. And when it ends like that, with no justice at all, it's hard to come up with a whistleblower story that's not just terribly sad and depressing. It's a man in a hole story where the man never gets out of the hole. Because if you measure the value of your actions by what they achieved, then the story you're going to tell yourself is that you were a chump. Right? You were the dumb money at the table. Everybody else knew that the system was rigged, and so they kept quiet. Only you were naive and gullible enough to throw away your career and your friends and your family for nothing. And that's a hard story to live with. I do think there are alternative stories that people can tell. Right? For some whistleblowers, I think it helps if they can think of their struggle as part of a larger struggle, right? For civil rights, in the case of ski, for example, or women's rights or disability rights. Right? So these are struggles where the verdict is going to be rendered by history, not by your immediate success or failure, right? But often that's a hard story to tell because it's rarely the case that the whistleblower struggles dovetails with a larger struggle in this way. I do think that it helps some people to tell themselves a story of honor, because what honor requires is not that you succeed, but that you're able to respect yourself when it's over. You can look in the mirror and not feel ashamed of yourself. And there may be other stories. I'm reminded here of something that Walker Percy, novelist Walker Percy, writes at the beginning of his essay, The Delta Factor. He says, when Franz Kafka was writing novels and stories in Prague, he used to get together with his friends and he'd read them his stories, which are all about the absurdity and the sadness and the alienation of life in the 20th century. And he'd read these stories out loud, and they would all laugh until tears came to their eyes. What's going on with that? Well, he says it's because reading a story about alienation to alienated listeners actually makes the alienation disappear. Like if you were in the grip of the sadness and the absurdity of life in the 20th century, then it's going to make you feel weirdly better to hear a story about the sadness and the alienation of life in the 20th century. And it'll make you feel better to write that book too, right? He says, if you want to see a truly alienated man, picture a Franz Kafka to whom it never occurred to write a word. This is how I feel when I read Fred Alford's book, right? Sentences like this, for example, or sentences like this. These are not hopeful sentences. These are not stories from a Man in a Hole book, right? But there is something weirdly reassuring about finding out that others have been through the same thing that you've been through. It's not a Man in a Hole story, but there is something there, right? And sometimes that kind of imagined solidarity has to be enough. All right, I told you it would be demoralizing, but I'm done. And I'm glad to take questions.